I know, I'm late. Gundam The Witch from Mercury concluded in July 2023 with its second season, and it's been quite the ride. I've been meaning to make this video for a while, but I'll be honest, I kinda just got a bad case of writer's block whenever I tried to sit down and actually structure the script. This was an important milestone. G-Witch was our first new non-build series since Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, so when the first season concluded in January, I made a video discussing my thoughts. I talked about how G-Witch has built a fantastic world filled with interesting characters, and was a show that had just the right amount of mystery and left us with questions yet to be answered in the second season. What I'd like to do in this video is once again discuss my thoughts on the show in its entirety now that it's over, and explain why I believe that it didn't quite live up to its potential. There were four main things that I was hoping to get out of Season 2 of G-Witch. Further expansion of the world, satisfying character writing, evolving the story beyond the dueling game, and a meaningful narrative that answers the questions that were set up in the first season. So did the second season accomplish those four things? Yes and no. G-Witch is a show that unfortunately suffers because it bites off more than it can chew. It does a fantastic job of setting up these intricate and enticing plot lines, but falls short when it comes to fulfilling them in a satisfying way due to the shorter nature of its runtime. Don't forget that the standard for Gundam shows is around 50 episodes, which is around 4 cours if you view it within the seasonal framework that anime tends to follow nowadays. G-Witch only had 2 cours or 24 episodes, meaning it had half that time to tell its story. This means that by default the narrative needs to be more streamlined, but it feels like G-Witch would have worked better with a third season or a full 50 episode run. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the things that G-Witch largely succeeded at. Like I mentioned in my Season 1 recap, G-Witch did an absolutely stellar job with its world building. The series moves away from the typical Gundam formula of taking place within a wartime setting and is instead set in a world where the power is held by large corporations. It also clearly establishes a rift between Earth and space, which isn't anything new in Gundam, but in this particular case is done in reverse, where the people in space have oppressed the people on Earth. Whereas in other series, Gundams are viewed as heroes, symbols of hope, or simply extremely powerful weapons, in G-Witch they're viewed as a curse due to their use of certain technologies, namely the gun format. And our protagonist is not a soldier piloting a mobile suit to fight a war, but rather a student who pilots one to fight duels for the sake of her bride-to-be. I wanted to see G-Witch further expand upon the building blocks it put in place during Season 1 and really show us what this world had to offer. This is important because when you think about it, the majority of the first season took place at Astacasia. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and if you were paying attention there was plenty of narrative development going on in the background. But one of the big criticisms I saw from people that couldn't get into the show was that they were wondering when things would start to get real and move beyond the confines of the campus. While I personally didn't mind the school setting as much as those that shared those criticisms, I understand where they were coming from and agreed that in order for the story to progress forward, the scope of the show needed to become broader. Thankfully, the second season did just that. The concept of the gun format, permit, and the data storm that was crafted so thoroughly in Season 1 is further developed by directly tying it into the narrative and Prospera's grand plan. We learn that Eri actually exists within the data storm and that her consciousness resides within the Aerial, which we'll get to in a later section of this video. Through Suletta's duels, Aerial reaches permit score 8, allowing Eri to move the mobile suit on her own without the need for Suletta as a pilot. This also allows Eri to be linked to Quiet Zero, the mysterious project that Prospera was working on with Delling. It's revealed that her goal is to create a massive data storm network within the Earth sphere in order for Eri to live freely. This plotline shows us applications of these technologies that we had never even considered before. A massive undertaking that would affect almost everyone in the Earth sphere, different from the original vision for Gun that Prospera shared with the rest of the Vanitas Institute because of her desire to be reunited with her daughter. We also get even further insight into the extent of the divide between the Earthians and the Spatians in Season 2. Previously, we had seen the disconnect in terms of the types of political issues the two groups were concerned with, as well as the exploitation and oppression of the people of Earth at the hands of the Spatian corporations. We got a glimpse of the living conditions of the Dawn of Fold, which is meant to make us as viewers sympathize with the group and perhaps view them more as a resistance than as terrorists. In Season 2, we learned that it's even worse than we thought. Not only are these people living in rundown buildings, but they also need to ration their food and water to ensure that there's enough to go around for everyone. Guel sees this firsthand when he is held prisoner by the Dawn of Fold and becomes caught up in the Banneret group's attack. And this is important because as someone who grew up in space as a member of the powerful Jeddark family, it was impossible for him to truly understand the extent of the oppression that the Earthians experience on a daily basis. That isn't even taking into account the conflicts that are forced onto the people of Earth by big corporations like those in the Bennett group. Throughout the show, you may have noticed that Shadik continuously mentions a concept called war partitioning. In case you didn't fully understand what it meant, this is when corporations sell weapons to those on Earth in order to instigate proxy wars. The effect of this tactic is twofold. One, it helps to finance the massive costs of space development, and two, it keeps the Earthians divided enough to prevent them from unifying into a singular Earth government and retaliating against the Spatians together. One of my favorite moments that once again gives us insight into the struggles that Earthians face is when Miorine goes to Earth with Guel for negotiations. At the very beginning of their meeting, the Earth representatives refuse to even shake her hand, and they have no interest in hearing her propositions despite her good intentions. Instead, they inform her of the staggering number of Earthians that have been missing, tortured, or dead as a result of the Bennett group's search for the group behind the Plant Quetta incident. Miorine had no idea this was happening, but by doing so, the group has acted outside of the law with little to no regard for any Earthian casualties suffered in the process. We then see firsthand the tension between the two groups when Prospera uses Ariel to stage an attack by Earthian activists. All it takes is one misfire and a distant explosion to pit the two groups against each other, but the thing I want to highlight here is the sheer difference in fighting strength. All the Earthians have are some trucks and tanks, while the Bennett group has deployed multiple mobile suits. The group clearly has the advantage, and yet despite having orders not to attack, they retaliate and destroy not only the activists' vehicles, but much of the surrounding buildings and infrastructure. This once again leads to many civilian casualties and demonstrates the lack of hesitation when it comes to taking Earthian lives. I find this shot of a child crying in the shadow of a Delanza to be absolutely haunting, almost like it's a perfect depiction of Earthian oppression in this universe. Now of course, we can't talk about the world of G-Witch without discussing the characters that inhabit it. In my Season 1 video, I talked about how G-Witch has a great cast of diverse characters, each with their own unique traits and motivations, and in Season 2 I really wanted to see them develop more as they continue to face new challenges. When it comes to the character writing in G-Witch, I believe there are two main themes that are prominent throughout the show: breaking free from curses, and the naivety that comes from the fact that most of the main cast are children. The first of those is much more impactful, and we see these various curses throughout the show and through the lens of multiple characters. And to be clear, when I say curses, I'm not talking about the curse of the Gundams that is widely feared in the world of G-Witch. I'm talking mainly about familial curses. G-Witch is a show where many of the main characters are forced to shoulder the burdens of their parents, and over the course of the narrative, we see them struggle to break free and become their own person. And the reason why this is a challenge is of course because they're still children who have been forced into a conflict initiated by adults and are left to deal with the consequences. Due to their immaturity, they often make emotional decisions rather than logical ones and fail to see the bigger picture. G-Witch gives us a rather intimate look at the consequences of teenagers being involved in these armed conflicts. Now, the concept of teenagers piloting mobile suits isn't exactly new in Gundam, but the difference here is that these characters are not like those from other Gundam series who were swept up into a war and became soldiers. They're students who were the victims of targeted attacks by circumstance. When you see both Choo-Choo and Guel experience symptoms of PTSD just by being in the cockpit of a mobile suit, you're reminded that these are kids we're talking about. These are small details, but they really drive home my point that these characters have been thrown into situations that no one their age should ever have to experience. Let's discuss this in more detail by analyzing some specific characters, starting with our protagonist, Suletta Mercury. At the end of Season 1 and at the beginning of Season 2, Suletta is still very much in Prospera's grasp. In fact, in the very first episode of Season 2, we see a phone call between the two where Prospera is consoling Suletta and convincing her that what she did at Plant Quetta was the right thing. Suletta is understandably shaken up by her experience, so she takes her mother's words as truth in order to absolve herself from guilt. We don't start to see Suletta's first real sense of doubt until the open campus attack, when she realizes she's being hypocritical by refuting Sophie's reasons for fighting and killing people. And yet, even after Sophie's death, she remains in denial, reminding herself that Gundams are meant to save people and faithfully repeating her mother's mantra to console herself. If you run, you gain 1, if you move forward, you gain 2. When Suletta finally has a chance to talk with Miorine again, Miorine apologizes to her but at the same time confronts her about Prospera's influence. Suletta's thinking has become so warped that when Miorine asks her if she would give up on her dream of building a school or use Gundams to kill people if Prospera asked, she says that she would. Keep in mind that during the open campus attack not too long ago, Suletta was denying Sophie's claims that mobile suits are for killing, stating that Gundams are meant to save people. At this point in the story, she's so distraught by her actions and the circumstances she finds herself in that she's completely dependent on Prospera to guide her moral compass. Because of this dependence, she is absolutely devastated when both Miorine and Eri push her away and can't see that their reasoning for doing so is to help Suletta break away from the curse that Prospera has placed on her. In Suletta's childish eyes, all she can understand is that she's lost the pillars that were supporting her all this time. However, after seeing Prospera's actions on Earth and with the help of Martin and the rest of Earth House, Suletta comes to realize that sometimes people have the right intentions but go about things the wrong way. And we see this again and again through multiple characters because, like I said, they're young and emotional, so they think they're making the right choice but can't see the consequences of their actions. She resolves not only to reconcile with Miorine, but to talk with Eri and Prospera one more time and help free them from the curse. Next, let's look at Miorine's character. On the surface, she seems far more mature compared to Suletta, but behind the mask of the young CEO turned president is a child struggling to fill her father's shoes. She has been under a familial curse from the very start, offered up by her father as a prize to whoever is strong enough to claim the title of holder. Miorine is the one that I believe struggles the most from a maturity standpoint because in this season she takes on a much more active role outside the school as both the CEO of Gundam Inc. and eventually the president of the Bennett Group. This means that out of all the main cast, she has the most interaction with adults and as a result is expected by both others and herself to stand on equal footing with them despite still being in high school. On top of her other responsibilities, she is constantly troubled by her concern for Suletta and her inability to decide on the right course of action. Her frustration comes to a head when her and Suletta reunite and discuss what happened at Plant Quetta. Suletta expresses her relief, saying that Prospera told her Miorine would see that she did the right thing. As I mentioned before, Miorine realizes in horror that Suletta would give up on her dreams and even kill people if her mother asked her to. Miorine then storms out and angrily confronts Prospera, demanding that she leave Suletta out of her schemes. And that's when Prospera drops the bomb that Delling is the object of her vengeance. She then takes advantage of Miorine's emotional state to offer her a deal: run for president of the Bennett Group and take over Quiet Zero in exchange for Suletta's freedom. But she also correctly warns Miorine that Suletta won't accept being separated from Ariel easily. This is where we see Miorine's biggest mistake. She accepts Prospera's deal and together with Guel conspires to sabotage a duel between him and Suletta to take Ariel away from her. After the deed is done, she treats Suletta harshly, saying that she can only make for a good shield if she wins and coldly pushing her former groom away. Of course, this is all done out of good intentions. At the end of the day, Miorine only wants Suletta to be happy and free. Unfortunately, Prospera just caught her at a time where she felt like she had no other options and she offered her a way out. This comes back to bite her during the disaster that takes place during her negotiations on Earth and when Prospera eliminates the Space Assembly League fleet that attacks Quiet Zero. These events cause Miorine to realize that Prospera manipulated her desire to save Suletta in order to get what she wanted. Unable to bear the burden anymore, she drops the adult mask she's been trying to keep up, blaming the loss of lives on herself and locking herself in her room. However, after talking with Suletta, she finds her resolve and learns the important lesson that it's okay to rely on others. She chooses to work with everyone rather than trying to shoulder the burden herself, and this is where we really see the culmination of her character arc and her quest to become her own person. She had already rejected Sarius' proposal to treat Grassley as a scapegoat, stating that she didn't want to sacrifice anyone else. Sarius recommended that she do this because it's what Delling would have done, and by refusing him she has already proven that she won't be like her father. Now she makes a deal with Shadik to not only expose the Space Assembly League's corruption, but to completely dissolve the Bennett Group. By the end of G-Witch, Miorine has become a woman who accepts her mistakes and still has the resolve to continue to move forward with the support of the people that she cares about. The final character I want to discuss is Guel, who also suffers from a curse related to his family. The difference between him and both Suletta and Miorine is that unlike those two, this is a curse that he's placed on himself. After the Season 1 finale, Guel has had to live with the sin of murdering his own father. He's being held captive by the Dawn of Fold, and he's so distraught that all he can do is absent-mindedly mumble to himself, to the point where he has to be force-fed to make sure he doesn't die. When he becomes caught up in the Bennett Group's attack, this is when he starts to come to his senses and realize what's happening around him. Keep in mind that Guel is from one of the 3 most influential families in the Bennett Group. When we first meet him in Season 1, he's extremely arrogant and looks down on people. He's probably never been to Earth in his life and has never once even considered the conditions that Earthians live in. When he emerges from the collapsed rubble that Olcott left him under, he finds Cynthia barely breathing and is immediately fueled by a desire to save this poor child. He comes across a wrecked mobile suit that he tries to use to get her to safety, but when he opens the cockpit, he comes face to face with the mangled body of the pilot and immediately vomits. Nevertheless, his determination doesn't waver and he brings Cynthia into the mobile suit to try and help her evacuate, but sadly she dies in his arms. I thought this entire episode was absolutely brilliant. It shows us a spoiled child who grew up in a life of comfort coming face to face with the horrors of war and the reality of the world he lives in for the first time. After this ordeal, he steels his resolve to go back to space and protect the things that tied him to his father as a way to make amends. But just because he's taken a big step forward doesn't mean that he's not still immature, and this brings us back to the theme we touched on earlier about having good intentions but going about things the wrong way. Guel views what happened to his father as his sin alone, and because of that he doesn't come clean to Lauda, which later drives Lauda even more over the edge close to the finale and nearly results in Guel's death. He also still retains his rash nature, which comes out when he returns from Earth and immediately attacks Shaddiq without obtaining any confession or proof for his accusations. There are more examples of character writing that I could talk about, but we don't have time to delve into every single one for the purposes of this video. The 3 characters we discussed in this section highlight the points I made earlier regarding my expectations for this season. They overcome challenges and continue to move forward despite their naivety, and as a result are able to form their own identities independent of the burdens of their families. The last 2 things I mentioned as part of my expectations were expanding the story beyond the dueling game and a satisfying narrative that answers the questions we were left with at the end of Season 1. These 2 points are very closely related, so we're going to discuss them in tandem. Again, one of the main complaints about Season 1 from people that didn't like the show or felt that they couldn't get into it is that the dueling game didn't feel like it had meaningful stakes. My general rebuttal to these arguments was that thanks to the information from the novel, we know that in the background Prospera has some sort of plan for revenge and is using the dueling game to do it. In hindsight, the issue with that is that it means the dueling game really only has stakes for a handful of people: Prospera, Suletta, Miorine, and Delling. So in Season 2, the story needed to move forward by introducing elements not related to duels, which it now had the opportunity to do following the attack on Planet Quetta. Let's begin with some of the questions I posed in my Season 1 recap video, starting with what the show did well. If you ask me, the most pressing questions since the beginning were related to Suletta's identity and the mysteries of the Ariel. These are questions that were integral to the success of the series, and when I tell you they nailed it, oh boy did they nail it. In my previous video, I theorized that Suletta could not possibly be Eri if the Vanitas incident happened 21 years ago. There's also the question of why Suletta is able to pilot the Ariel and control the gun bits without any feedback from the Datastorm. I mentioned that there were some theories floating around in the community that Eri and Ariel are the same, and that each of the gun bits contained the soul of a failed replacement for Eri. These turned out to be almost right on the money. But what's really amazing is the way this is revealed to us, because it's done over the course of multiple episodes. During the open campus attack, Ariel takes over the gun Volvas and attacks Sophie despite Suletta's pleas for her to stop. Before Sophie dies, she sees Eri within the Datastorm, and it's confirmed by Prospera and Bell that the Ariel is in fact Eri. A couple of episodes later, we learn that after the Vanitas incident, Prospera, who at the time was Elnora, escaped with Eri. But Eri's body couldn't survive the harsh environment of space, so Prospera transferred her biometric code into the Elfrith, which later became the Ariel. By using Quiet Zero to expand the Datastorm, she hopes to create a world where Eri can live freely. Now we know why Suletta never had any permit markings on her face and seemed to be unaffected by the Datastorm. It's because Eri was taking on the burden of the Datastorm for her. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. Who exactly is Suletta if she isn't Eri? Suletta gets the answer to this question from Eri herself, who pulls her into the Datastorm and speaks with her face to face. They're also surrounded by many copies of Eri that Suletta refers to as everyone, the same way she refers to the gun bits. Eri reveals that Suletta and the others were all Repli children made from her genes, and that Suletta was the key needed to help Ariel reach Permit Score 8, which was achieved in her duel with Guel. Eri also says that at Score 8 she can move on her own without the need for a pilot and therefore doesn't need Suletta anymore. Suletta is of course very emotional and confused and can't see it at the time, but we now know that the reason Eri did this is to protect her from the crimes Prospera intended to commit. This entire reveal was so satisfying. It finally gave us the motivation for Prospera's actions, and Eri's decision to tell Suletta the truth is what finally leads to her turning point as a character. It also sets up this cool opportunity for Eri and Ariel to be the final boss that Suletta has to face, which to my knowledge is the first time that the main Gundam has been the antagonist at the end of a series. So pretty much everything involving Suletta, her origins, the Ariel, and Eri was all phenomenal. I loved it. I also wanted to know if Shaddiq would be exposed as the mastermind behind the Planet Quetta incident, and if so, how that would actually happen. I think having Guel learn about this through a random remark from Sato, who we recognized from his time with Dawn of Fold, is a genius idea. It brings back his earlier experience on Earth as an interesting plot device, while at the same time presenting a new challenge for him and Miorine in the form of a lack of concrete evidence. Fantastic job, no complaints there. Here's where we get to the stuff that kind of fell flat or missed the mark. Another big question that remained after the Season 1 finale was simply the fallout that all the different characters would have to face after such a significant event. Planet Quetta was attacked by the Dawn of Fold, and students from Astacassia were caught up in that attack. Suletta was called a murderer by her own fiancé, Martin caught Nika red-handed signaling the enemy, Guel accidentally killed his father. This attack had implications for almost every major character in the series. And yet, at the start of Season 2, I feel like it just wasn't addressed or emphasized enough. It's not as if everyone pretends that it never happened, and we do eventually see the consequences, like when Martin turns Nika in and when Suletta and Miorine eventually reconcile, but I was hoping we'd see more of the immediate fallout of those events. Another big question, of course, is what would happen to Delling after his injury. He's not exactly the most important character, but he is still the president of the Bennett Group and the one working with Prospera on Quiet Zero. I mentioned in my previous video that it also seemed like after the Season 1 finale we might get a glimpse into his and Miorine's past, what happened to her mother, and why their relationship is so damaged. And we just got none of that. Delling is in a coma until the end of the season and basically plays no role at all besides failing to get the Space Assembly League to halt their attack. And this is just one example of my key critique of G-Witch that I mentioned earlier. It tries to do too much. It sets up some great premises that might have worked well with a longer runtime, but instead many characters, organizations, and plot lines end up falling out of the picture. Delling is just one of them, but if you don't believe me, let's take a look at some other examples. We talked about Guel's character earlier, so let's bring him back into the discussion. His experiences on Earth marked a defining change for him and led to him pulling himself out of despair and making the decision to go back to space. I think what a lot of people were hoping for was for him to go back and try to be a part of the change that Miorine was hoping to bring about now that he understands the plight of those on Earth. We just didn't really see any of that. When he goes to Earth with Miorine, he gets sidetracked when he runs into Sato and then goes back to space ahead of her when he learns about Shaddiq. Again, I liked that part of the plot, but it still means that he played little to no active role in establishing relations between Earth and space. Speaking of their trip to Earth, let's talk about the insane revelation we get from Prospera. She leaves the protest area to go attack a facility filled with mass production Elfriths that's revealed to belong to Ox Earth. In case you need a refresher, Ox Earth is the company that acquired the Vanadis Institute before the events of the prologue and shifted their focus to using the gun format for military purposes. At the same time, Fang informs Bell that the ones backing Ox Earth are none other than the Space Assembly League with the intention of forcibly suppressing the Bennett Group. And as if all that wasn't crazy enough, the Elfrith Ur and Elfrith Thorn deployed by the Dawn of Fold came from Ox Earth as well. The implications of this reveal are massive. This essentially means that the Space Assembly League was using Sophie and Noria as undercover assets to carry out terrorist attacks against the Bennett Group. And this huge revelation amounts to nothing. The League does end up being the bad guys in the end, but none of that takes this new information into account. They're just bad for the sake of being bad. As for the Dawn of Fold, they also amount to having close to zero impact on the story after this point. We just learned that the League has revived Ox Earth to back an anti-space organization that they were likely just manipulating to suit their own needs, and yet after Sophie's death and Noria's capture, they just fade out of the picture. I mean, take Olcott for example. During Guel's time on Earth, we got a look at his past, how he lost his family, and why that led to him cutting off any sentimental ties. We also learned that he was a former Dominicus member, and towards the end we get an interaction between him and Guel that almost makes it seem like he's going to play a bigger role in the story. Nope, he just disappears until the final episode where he shows up for just a few seconds with Naji. I'm not saying that every single subplot is a miss, there are some that I genuinely enjoyed. I thought the whole situation with Nika, LN5, and Noria being locked in a room together was awesome. Between Nika and Noria trading jabs about their ideals when it came to relations between Earth and space, and LN5 and Noria's relationship building over time through their similarities, I thought it made for a really interesting character dynamic. It also made her death that much more heartbreaking and really makes you feel for LN5 despite his previously scummy behavior. You can tell that he's trying to be better and form a genuine connection with someone, and that just gets ripped away from him because of circumstances out of his control. But the vast majority of these plot elements are just not utilized in any meaningful way because the main story needed to wrap up in these 12 episodes. Which brings me to the ending. In case you haven't noticed throughout the rest of this video, I'm not here to spread pointless negativity or just trash talk the show without any reason to back it up. I didn't hate the ending like so many other people are saying, but I couldn't help but feel like it was rushed. In the last few episodes, we have Prospera activate Quiet Zero and her plan enters its final stage. Pale has jumped ship and blown the whistle to the League and accused the Benerit group of creating Quiet Zero as a weapon of mass destruction. Suletta has made the decision to pilot the Gundam Calibarn despite the risks and help her friends infiltrate the massive fortress to shut it down. And Lauda has taken the Gundam Schwarzette with the intention of killing Miorine because he sees her as the cause of everything that's gone wrong. I remember watching these last 5 episodes and thinking that there must be a 3rd season planned because there was just so much going on. But as we got closer to the end, I realized that they were trying to wrap everything up in this season after all, which is why I say the ending was rushed. Like, where did Lauda's grudge against Miorine come from? He spent the entire show talking down to Suletta, resenting her and calling her a Mercurian wench, and now all of a sudden he shifts his anger to Miorine? Don't get me wrong, I can see in his immaturity that he would come to the conclusion that the damage to the school and Petra's injured condition are Miorine's fault, but if that's going to be the case, that needs to be built up over the course of the narrative. Having him hate on Suletta this whole time and then shift gears at the end is just very abrupt and doesn't really work. And it's not just Lauda, a lot of the elements of G-Witch's ending seem like they shouldn't really make sense and are kinda just there for convenience. Notre just so happens to have programmed an emergency shutdown code for Quiet Zero and left the message for Miorine in the genetic code of her tomatoes. Pale is set up as an antagonist for just a few short episodes and then immediately shut down before they get a chance to do anything. Miorine dissolves and liquidates the Benerit group, and yet the Space Assembly League still decides to be evil for the sake of being evil and fire the cliché giant space laser again. Even at the very end, when Suletta takes over all the Gundams and uses them to shut down the satellite and then forces them to all disappear into thin air. Don't get me wrong, I thought it was neat, but I was also thinking to myself, wait, she can do that? I mentioned it in a previous section of this video, but honestly, I think my favorite part of the ending was the solution that Miorine came up with. By collaborating with Shaddiq to implicate the League and dissolving the group and selling its assets to Earthian corporations, she not only leaves the League with no reason to keep attacking, even though they do anyway like we discussed earlier, but she comes into her own as a leader and begins to make good on her promise to bridge the gap between Earth and space. I also loved every second of the time skip where we got to see where everybody is after graduating. In fact, my only complaint here is that I wanted that portion to be longer. I wish we could have seen the wedding and spent a little more time with the main cast's slice of lifestyle. I know we talked about a lot in this video and I mentioned quite a few things that fell short of my expectations, but let me make one thing perfectly clear. I consider G-Witch to be a success. This show was different from the traditional Gundam formula and proved that a Gundam series can still be enjoyable even if it's not filled with constant war, tragedy, and death. Not only that, the school setting and the fact that it's a standalone entry made it much more approachable for new viewers, resulting in a large influx of new Gundam fans. And to top it all off, it included LGBTQ representation for those in the Gundam community that identify with it, which I think is great. It was an absolute blast watching G-Witch every week and discussing it with people on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, pretty much wherever conversations were happening. But I couldn't help feeling that it could have been so much more. So I'm not hating on G-Witch because I thought it was bad. I'm just a little disappointed because I feel that the show had so much potential that it didn't quite live up to. I would have loved to see how the show would have turned out if it was given a longer runtime and therefore more room to flesh out its narrative. I'm interested to hear where all of you stand on this. Did G-Witch check off all of the boxes for what you were hoping to see in a Gundam series? Or were you left wanting a little more? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. All I ask is that you keep the discussion civil. I know this was a long one, so if you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a positive rating and subscribe to the channel for more Gundam content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.